January 15th, 1965. Hanoi, North Vietnam. General Vo Nguyen Giap stood before a detailed map of Indochina, his weathered hands tracing the supply routes that snaked through dense jungle, over treacherous mountains, and across countless rivers. The architect of France's humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu 11 years earlier, Giap had earned his reputation as one of the century's most brilliant military strategists, not through conventional warfare, but through mastering the art of fighting against technologically superior enemies. Now, as American military advisors in South Vietnam were being replaced by combat troops, Giap and his fellow North Vietnamese commanders were analyzing their new opponent with the cold calculation that had destroyed French colonial power. Their assessment was unanimous and dismissive. The Americans, despite their overwhelming technological advantages and seemingly unlimited resources, would fail in Vietnam for the same reason the French had failed. They didn't understand jungle warfare. They couldn't adapt to fighting an enemy that melted into the population. And most critically, they would never solve the fundamental problem that had defeated every foreign power that had attempted to conquer Vietnam: logistics. The Vietnamese generals laughed, quite literally, at American logistics. They had studied American military doctrine, read translated American field manuals, and observed American operations during the advisory period. What they saw convinced them that American forces were designed for conventional warfare in Europe, for tank battles across open plains, for massive set-piece engagements where superior firepower could be brought to bear in overwhelming concentrations. The Americans, Giap and his colleagues concluded, had built a military machine that depended on massive supply requirements, on constant delivery of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment, on complex supply chains that required roads, ports, airfields, and elaborate base infrastructure. This dependency, they believed, was a fatal weakness that could be exploited. In Vietnam's jungles, mountains, and rice paddies, where there were few roads and where those that existed could be easily ambushed or destroyed, where the climate corroded equipment and rotted supplies, where there were no deep water ports capable of handling large cargo ships, and where any infrastructure would be under constant attack, the American logistics system would collapse. American soldiers, accustomed to abundance and dependent on technology, would find themselves isolated, undersupplied, and vulnerable. The jungle would defeat the Americans, not through direct military confrontation, but by strangling their supply lines and making it impossible to sustain large-scale operations. This assessment seemed entirely reasonable based on historical evidence and understanding of Vietnam's terrain and climate. The French, despite having decades of colonial infrastructure to build upon, had struggled constantly with logistics throughout their war in Indochina. French forces operating away from major population centers frequently found themselves cut off, besieged, and starving. The climactic battle of Dien Bien Phu had been lost largely because the French couldn't maintain adequate aerial resupply to their isolated garrison, while Giap's forces, supplied by porters carrying supplies on their backs along jungle trails, had sustained a 57-day siege and massive artillery bombardment that destroyed French fortifications. The lesson seemed clear. In Vietnam, sophisticated logistics systems designed for conventional warfare were liabilities, while simple, flexible supply methods adapted to jungle conditions were assets. The Vietnamese, who had been moving supplies through jungle trails for generations, who could live off the land when necessary, who traveled light and demanded little, would outlast the Americans, who required tons of supplies per soldier, and who couldn't function without their elaborate support infrastructure. What the Vietnamese generals didn't fully appreciate, what they couldn't entirely foresee despite their intelligence and experience, was the sheer scale and innovative power of American industrial and logistical capability. They understood that America was wealthy and productive, but they assumed American military logistics would follow conventional patterns, would be constrained by traditional limitations, and would be vulnerable to traditional countermeasures. They were about to discover that American logistics in Vietnam would be unlike anything the world had ever seen, a combination of massive industrial production, revolutionary transportation methods, unprecedented construction capability, and innovative problem-solving that would create what soldiers would come to call the Jungle Express, a supply system so powerful, so flexible, and so comprehensive that it would deliver everything from hot meals to ice cream, from bullets to bulldozers, from replacement parts to replacement soldiers, to the most remote jungle outposts with reliability that seemed impossible. To understand how American logistics achieved what Vietnamese generals believed impossible, we must first understand the magnitude of the challenge. Vietnam presented perhaps the most difficult logistics environment imaginable for a modern military force. The country's geography seemed specifically designed to frustrate conventional supply operations. Dense jungle covered much of the terrain, with triple canopy rainforests so thick that ground visibility was measured in yards, and where the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Mountains dominated the western regions, with peaks reaching over 10,000 feet, and valleys so steep that roads were impossible to build without massive engineering efforts. Rivers crisscrossed the landscape, flooding dramatically during monsoon season and creating impassable barriers. Rice paddies covered much of the lowlands, with soil too soft to support heavy vehicles, and with water levels that varied dramatically with seasons. The climate was equally hostile to military operations. Vietnam's tropical environment meant constant high heat and humidity that exhausted soldiers, corroded equipment, and created ideal conditions for disease. The monsoon season brought torrential rains that turned roads to rivers and made air operations dangerous or impossible. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity approaching 100%, creating conditions where soldiers could suffer heat exhaustion within hours and where equipment failures were constant. Everything rusted, everything rotted, everything deteriorated at rates that seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't experienced tropical warfare. The infrastructure situation was equally daunting. South Vietnam in 1965 had virtually no deep-water ports capable of handling large cargo ships. The existing port facilities at Saigon, Cam Ranh Bay, and Da Nang were primitive, with limited pier space, no container handling equipment, and capacity measured in thousands of tons per month rather than the hundreds of thousands of tons per month that American forces would require. The road network was minimal, consisting mainly of Route 1, which ran along the coast and was vulnerable to ambush and destruction, and a few secondary roads that were often impassable during monsoon season. There were no rail lines suitable for military freight. Airfields existed but were small, with short runways unable to handle large transport aircraft and with minimal support facilities. Perhaps most challenging was the security environment. Unlike conventional warfare where rear areas were relatively safe and where supply routes could be protected by frontline combat forces, Vietnam offered no secure rear. The Viet Cong insurgency meant that supply convoys could be ambushed anywhere, that base camps could be attacked, that supply dumps could be infiltrated and sabotaged, and that even supposedly secure areas required constant vigilance. Every supply route was a potential battleground, every warehouse a potential target, every delivery a mission that required armed escorts and defensive planning. The American logistics response began with the most fundamental requirement: getting supplies into Vietnam in the first place. The lack of deep-water ports presented an immediate crisis. American planners needed to deliver millions of tons of supplies annually, but South Vietnam's existing ports could handle only a fraction of this volume. The conventional solution would have been to spend years constructing port facilities. But American forces needed supplies immediately, and they needed them in quantities that increased monthly as more troops deployed. The solution they developed became known as the De Long Pier system, a revolutionary approach to port construction that Vietnamese planners had never imagined. Rather than building traditional piers from the ground up, requiring years of construction and massive investment in permanent infrastructure, American engineers shipped complete pier sections from the United States as floating structures. These enormous steel platforms, each as large as a city block, were constructed in American shipyards, loaded onto transport ships, towed across the Pacific Ocean, positioned at designated locations along the Vietnamese coast, and then sunk and secured to create instant deep-water piers capable of handling the largest cargo ships. The first De Long Pier at Cam Ranh Bay became operational in 1966, just months after construction began, and could handle ships that would have been impossible to berth at Vietnam's traditional ports. Additional piers followed at multiple locations, creating port capacity that matched or exceeded major American commercial ports, and doing so in a fraction of the time traditional construction would have required. But piers alone weren't enough. Ships arriving at these new ports needed to be unloaded quickly, and their cargoes moved to storage areas and then distributed to units across Vietnam. The traditional method of cargo handling, stevedores manually loading and unloading individual crates and boxes using cranes and muscle power, was far too slow for the volumes American forces required. The solution was containerization, a revolutionary system that the American military adopted years before it became standard in commercial shipping. Rather than loading ships with individual items that each had to be handled separately, supplies were packed into standardized 20-foot and 40-foot steel containers that could be lifted as single units by specialized cranes. A container ship could be unloaded in hours rather than days, with containers lifted directly from ship to truck or rail car and transported to their destinations without ever opening them at the port. This containerization system, combined with the new pier facilities, transformed Vietnam's ports from bottlenecks into superhighways of supply. By 1968, American-built port facilities in Vietnam were handling over 850,000 tons of supplies per month, more than the entire German port system had handled during the North Africa campaign in World War II. Ships that would have required weeks to unload using traditional methods were emptied in less than a day. The port of Cam Ranh Bay became one of the busiest ports in the world, handling more cargo tonnage than most major commercial ports in peacetime, and doing so in a war zone under constant threat of attack. Vietnamese commanders watching this transformation began to realize their logistics assumptions were flawed. They had believed that the lack of port infrastructure would constrain American supply capability, would force Americans to rely on existing facilities that could be targeted and disrupted, and would create choke points where American supplies would pile up in vulnerable concentrations. Instead, the Americans had created port capacity from nothing, had done so with breathtaking speed, and had developed systems that seemed immune to the bottlenecks that conventional logistics wisdom said were inevitable. The American response to Vietnam's transportation challenges revolutionized military logistics even more dramatically than their port innovations. The conventional wisdom was that armies needed roads to move supplies, that without an extensive road network, large-scale military operations were impossible, and that building roads through Vietnam's terrain would require years of effort and would create vulnerable targets that could be easily destroyed by a determined enemy. American planners looked at this conventional wisdom and essentially said, then we won't rely on roads. Instead, they would create the Jungle Express, a supply system that used helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and innovative ground transportation methods to deliver supplies anywhere in Vietnam, regardless of terrain, regardless of roads, and with speed and reliability that seemed magical to soldiers receiving deliveries. The helicopter emerged as the signature innovation of American logistics in Vietnam, transforming warfare in ways that are difficult to overstate. Previous wars had featured limited helicopter use for medical evacuation and reconnaissance, but Vietnam saw helicopters deployed in quantities and for purposes that were entirely unprecedented. The Bell UH-1 Huey became the iconic symbol of American involvement in Vietnam, a versatile workhorse that could carry troops, supplies, weapons, or wounded soldiers with equal facility. But for logistics purposes, the real revolution came with heavy-lift helicopters like the CH-47 Chinook and the CH-54 Sky Crane, which could carry loads measured in tons rather than pounds, and which could deliver supplies to locations that were absolutely inaccessible by any other means. These heavy-lift helicopters made it possible to supply fire bases, landing zones, and special forces camps that had no road access, that were surrounded by enemy-controlled territory, and that were located in terrain where conventional logistics wisdom said sustained operations were impossible. A Chinook helicopter could deliver several tons of supplies, ammunition, food, water, fuel, construction materials, whatever was needed, to a mountaintop outpost in a single flight, making trips in hours that would have taken days or weeks using ground transportation and porters. The CH-54 Sky Crane could lift entire vehicles, artillery pieces, or prefabricated buildings and deliver them to remote locations. This aerial supply capability meant that American forces weren't constrained by terrain or by roads, could establish bases anywhere, and could sustain operations in locations that Vietnamese forces had considered inaccessible to Americans. The scale of helicopter logistics operations in Vietnam was staggering. At the peak of American involvement, There were over 5,000 helicopters operating in Vietnam, flying hundreds of thousands of sorties annually and moving millions of tons of supplies. Entire supply chains were built around helicopter delivery, with forward supply bases positioned throughout Vietnam where supplies were broken down into helicopter-sized loads and dispatched to combat units on demand. A company operating in dense jungle could request resupply by radio and receive delivery within hours. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, replacement equipment, whatever they needed, dropped at their location by helicopter. This capability fundamentally changed warfare, eliminating the supply line vulnerabilities that had constrained military operations throughout history. Vietnamese commanders initially tried to counter this aerial supply system using anti-aircraft fire and by targeting helicopter landing zones, but the sheer number of helicopters and the flexibility of the system made effective interdiction nearly impossible. Americans could simply route supplies through different helicopters to different landing zones, could saturate defenses with multiple simultaneous deliveries, and could replace helicopter losses faster than Vietnamese forces could shoot them down. For every helicopter lost, 2 more arrived from the United States. The aerial supply system proved essentially invulnerable to the interdiction tactics that had worked against French supply lines. Fixed-wing transport aircraft provided even greater cargo capacity for longer distances, creating aerial supply routes that moved supplies from ports and major bases to forward airfields throughout Vietnam. The Lockheed C-130. Hercules became the workhorse of this system, a 4-engine turboprop transport that could carry over 20 tons of cargo, could land on short, rough airstrips that would have been impossible for larger aircraft, and could operate with minimal ground support. C-130S flew constant circuits throughout Vietnam, delivering supplies to remote airfields that were then redistributed by helicopter or truck to combat units. For even larger cargo requirements, the C-123 provider, and eventually the enormous C-5 Galaxy, provided strategic airlift capability. The C-5, one of the largest aircraft in the world, could carry over 100 tons of cargo, including fully assembled helicopters, trucks, artillery pieces, and other outsized equipment. This aircraft made it possible to deliver replacement equipment directly from the United States to Vietnam in days rather than the weeks required for sea transport, creating a logistics pipeline that could respond to urgent needs with unprecedented speed. The combination of helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft created a 3-dimensional logistics network that simply bypassed the terrain and infrastructure limitations that Vietnamese planners had assumed would constrain American operations. Supplies moved from ports to major bases by truck or rail, from major bases to forward bases by C-130 transport, from forward bases to fire bases by Chinook helicopter, and from fire bases to combat units by Huey helicopter. This system could deliver supplies anywhere in Vietnam within 24 hours of request, could adapt instantly to changing operational needs, and operated with a reliability that seemed impossible given the hostile environment and constant enemy action. Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap, in a post-war interview, admitted that he had badly underestimated American logistics capabilities, particularly aerial supply. We planned to cut their supply lines, to isolate their units, to force them to withdraw by making it impossible to sustain forward bases, he said. But they had no supply lines to cut in the traditional sense. Their supplies came from the sky, and we couldn't stop the sky. The Jungle Express required unprecedented construction capability to create the bases, airfields, storage facilities, and infrastructure needed to support American operations. The Vietnamese generals had assumed that construction in Vietnam's difficult terrain and climate would be slow, expensive, and vulnerable to disruption. They were unprepared for the scale and speed of American military construction, which transformed South Vietnam's landscape in ways that seemed impossible. The logistics system that supported American forces in Vietnam also featured innovations in supply management that revolutionized how armies tracked and delivered supplies. Traditional military supply systems relied on estimates of need, on pushing supplies forward based on planning assumptions, and on maintaining large reserve stocks to buffer against uncertainty. American logistics innovators in Vietnam developed systems that moved toward just-in-time delivery, where supplies were pulled through the system based on actual need rather than pushed based on estimates. The computerized logistics systems developed for Vietnam primitive by today's standards but revolutionary for the 1960s, tracked millions of items throughout the supply pipeline, could identify where any item was located, and could direct supplies to wherever they were needed most urgently. A maintenance unit needing a specific replacement part for a helicopter could query the computer system, locate the part at a supply depot elsewhere in Vietnam, and have it delivered by the next day's supply flight. This capability reduced the need for units to maintain large stockpiles of spare parts and supplies, reduced waste from items sitting in storage until they became obsolete, and ensured that scarce items went to wherever they were needed most urgently. The logistics system also featured unprecedented attention to soldier welfare, delivering not just the military essentials of ammunition, fuel, and food, but also comfort items, recreational facilities, and amenities that seemed absurdly luxurious for a combat zone. American soldiers in Vietnam had access to hot meals prepared in mess halls, cold drinks from refrigerated storage, mail delivered from home within days, post exchanges where they could purchase consumer goods, enlisted and officer clubs where they could relax, and even swimming pools at major bases. The Vietnamese generals found this aspect of American logistics simultaneously impressive and baffling. They couldn't understand why Americans devoted enormous logistics resources to delivering ice cream, soft drinks, and other non-essential items to soldiers in a war zone. But American military leadership understood something profound. Morale matters, and morale requires more than just military essentials. The ability to deliver comfort items, to provide amenities that reminded soldiers of home, and to maintain living standards far above those of any previous army in the field, paid enormous dividends in maintaining soldier effectiveness and will to fight. The legacy of American logistics innovations in Vietnam extended far beyond the war itself. The containerization systems developed and refined in Vietnam revolutionized commercial shipping worldwide. The helicopter logistics concepts pioneered in Vietnam became standard for military operations globally. The computerized supply tracking systems evolved into modern inventory management. The construction techniques for rapid base establishment influenced both military and civilian emergency response capabilities. The medical evacuation and treatment systems set standards that military and civilian emergency medicine still follow. The Jungle Express that Vietnamese generals had mocked before experiencing it, that they had confidently predicted would fail in Vietnam's hostile environment, had instead proved to be one of the most remarkable logistics achievements in military history. It hadn't won the war. Logistics alone can never determine political outcomes, but it had accomplished something perhaps even more impressive. It had made the impossible routine, had turned insurmountable obstacles into minor inconveniences, and had demonstrated that with sufficient innovation, resources, and determination, even the most challenging logistics problems could be solved. The laughter of Vietnamese generals at American logistics had been replaced by grudging respect, and the lessons learned in Vietnam's jungles would shape military logistics for generations to come.